think we'll make a start. So thank you to everybody for joining the Breathing City seminar this month. I'm sure there may be a few more people who will be joining over the next few minutes. I think most of you are aware of Breathing City, but anybody who's less aware, with a future urban ventilation network, otherwise known as Breathing City, and focus on ventilation and indoor-outdoor exchange of air to understand air quality. And we think around both the sort of measurement and modelling of that, right the way through to technology and the behavioural aspects through to policy and implications. So really trying to understand all those complex factors that affect ventilation of buildings and what happens within those buildings. So really pleased today that we've got Professor Lucie Middlemiss, who's going to give us a talk. So Lucie is a professor at the University of Leeds. She's a professor of environment and society. Her research interests are around sustainable consumption, energy poverty, participation in sustainable development, and her research on energy poverty is bringing together qualitative insights into the lived experience together with critical policy analysis. She's involved in a whole raft of different projects. So some of the things she's working on at the moment are one called the UK ERC Whole Person, Whole Place, where she's working with local authorities and communities around renovating and retrofitting home. She's working on a project about understanding family and community vulnerabilities in transition to net zero. And then a project called Wellbased, which is about designing, implementing and evaluating a comprehensive urban programme around how to reduce energy poverty and its effect on citizens' health and well-being. So really pleased to have you here, Lucie. And also I think this is particularly topical at the moment because people are really focused around energy. I've sort of forgotten a little bit about ventilation, but I'm thinking about the energy in their homes. And of course, some of the things people do might result in mould. So I'm going to hand over to you, and really looking forward to hearing this.
Thanks very much, Kath. As I was preparing these slides yesterday, I kind of realised that perhaps I'm mainly focusing on the first two words in this title. Although I think a lot of the insights that we have through the energy poverty research that we've done to date also are very relevant to the energy crisis. Given that we kind of understand what people are going through and what needs to be done effectively about these things. And then the mould part is something that perhaps has come into my interest a bit more recently. And I'm lucky enough today to have Cyril with me, Cyril Vonderup, who's also listening. She won't be presenting today, but she was a really important part of the mould work that we've done. And given the audience today, I thought it was really great to have her here and also to be talking a little bit about that work, as well as the well-based work, which is also links into issues of public health and internal air quality. So I wanted to start off by talking about what is energy poverty, because I'm aware that not all of you will necessarily have heard of this term before, perhaps especially those based in the UK who might more likely have heard of the term fuel poverty. In the UK and in broader sort of definitions of what this is, we tend to call it talk about it as the inability of households to access adequate energy services. And by energy services, we mean anything that you do in the home that uses energy. So home heating, cooling, electrical appliance use, so cooking, refrigeration, this kind of thing. As well as mobility. The only difference really in the UK term fuel poverty is it tends not to include mobility, but otherwise it sort of tends to mean the same thing. In the academic world, we use the term energy poverty because that's what is commonly used throughout the world. When I face UK policy conversations, I use fuel poverty. So I use them effectively entirely interchangeably. In the academic world, this has sort of been a topic that arose in the UK and that has been studied perhaps since the 80s and 90s. In more recent work, there's been a lot more attention on this in the last 10 to 20 years. And I would say that it's seen as this sort of very multifaceted, dynamic and complex problem. The original definition of the problem was people being on a low income, having high energy bills and living in energy inefficient households. And really through the involvement of qualitative researchers, this definition has broadened effectively. And then it's also been taken up in the EU policy world and is now a widely used term in the European Union and in member state policy. I would say it's firmly on the agenda as part of the energy transition. So part of thinking of low carbon futures, we're also thinking about fair low carbon futures. And also just to say that's through the hard work and activism of actually a lot of academics, as well as policymakers and practitioners, that's become firmly ensconced on the EU agenda. It's already on the UK agenda. It's been on the UK agenda for years under the term fuel poverty, but it's more recently become something that the EU are also interested in. Sorry, I've just moved my screen around so I can't move it on. Right. Today, the things I want to talk about in particular are my research in the field, which has been it started with an interest in the lived experience of energy poverty in collaboration with various co-authors that are listed here and that I'll reference at the end, which looks at how people experience this problem in a really kind of deep way. The reason I started thinking about the lived experience of energy poverty was I'm interested in people's experiences of resource scarcity in the global north. I think this is important both for thinking about now, so what are the problems in the world now and how do we resolve these sort of problems of injustice, but also for thinking about transitions to a low carbon society. So you need to understand people's daily lives now in order to be able to think about how they might be transformed for the future. So the lived experience work then inspired a second area of interest, which is in energy poverty policy. And really what happened was I was looking at everyday life, then looking back at policy and thinking these things are not linking in well enough. And that led me to take a relatively critical approach to policy analysis. And the various papers listed there, most of them are really thinking about, well, what's wrong with the way that it's conceptualized and how could we do a better job of this? And the main space in which I've been able to have a more productive impact on policy is in the Netherlands, where we wrote this white paper on the problem. And since then, that's been kind of taken up by government who are trying to turn it into policy effectively. So that's really nice direct effect. And then the final part of my talk will be really finishing with linking to your interests as a research group. So there's sort of links to air quality and health through the work with Cyril and also through the Wellbased project, which is sort of just kicked off in the last month or two. So I'm going to start by giving quite a lot of detail about an example of the lived experience of energy poverty, just to kind of give you a flavour of what this research is for. It's really about understanding this problem in detail, and we gather the data by doing long interviews with people about their experiences of not being able to access adequate energy services. What it gives us then is this detailed sort of explanation or exploration of the site in which the problem actually occurs. And the benefit of this is to understand how people are affected by policy, but also to show where the opportunities are for different kinds of action. And in a way to show what we know and don't know about people's lives, or where we're intervening well, where we're intervening badly, this kind of thing. And I'm going to do this through an example, and it's the story of Usha. Usha's 35. She lives with a daughter who's 10 in a small privately rented house in Bradford, which is poorly insulated and poorly maintained. She's disabled. Her daughter helps care for her, as do her siblings and her mum, who sleep overnight at her house on a rotating basis, as well as paid carers who come in during the day. Usha and her daughter go to live with her mum during school holidays, and her daughter stays with her sister or her ex-husband when Usha's in hospital. Given this rather transient household, it's a bit difficult to say who actually lives with her, or indeed where she lives. Usha has a chronic health condition similar to MS following a medical accident, and she's relatively limited mobility, chronic pain, incontinence, and low energy levels, resulting in a heightened need for warmth, regular hot water, and additional clothes washing. Before she had her accident, she was married and had her own home and worked as a lawyer. And that's quite important for the way she sees herself. Usha depends extensively on negotiated relationships with others to help her access energy services. For instance, her prepay meter needs topping up at the local shop, which she can't easily access alone. She needs help to access the shower. She sometimes can't get out of bed to take her daughter to school in the morning and has to ask friends for help with this. Usha also frequently borrows money from her family for her energy bills. Having a prepayment meter, is important to note, is a condition of her tenancy. As a disabled person, Usha's living in a time of uncertainty. This was back in 2016, with her status and access to support under threat as disability policy was reviewed in the UK. And this caused intense worry for her about how she might cope with the extra income in the car. Sorry, without the extra income in the car. Usha was previously fiercely independent, but since the accident has had to rely on others, and she really hates this. Her descent into poverty has been distressing with regard to her self-image as an independent and self-sufficient person. Her various identities as a mother, being from a Pakistani background, being disabled, also impact on her energy consumption and her social life. For instance, she wants to cook from scratch for her daughter. She feels it's part of being a Pakistani mother, but has to be mindful of the associated energy costs. She also rarely goes to other people's houses because she needs extra warmth everywhere, and she's embarrassed to go as a 30-something woman and ask for blankets in other people's homes. So the case study of Usha is one that, as I say, I researched in 2016. And just prior to that, the first bit of work I did on the lived experience of energy poverty was with a colleague, Ross Gillard. And here we characterised how people experience the problem and how they also understand the challenges that they face. And we identified these 6 elements that are experienced as vulnerability by households that are in fuel poverty. Households effectively can be made more or less vulnerable to energy poverty in relation to each of these challenges. And I would say that the yellow bullet points on screen are the areas in which we have particular insights, I suppose, for the energy crisis. So these things seem to be intensifying right now in the work that we're doing at the moment. So the first of these, quality of dwelling fabric, effectively means the efficiency of the home that people are living in, and those people that live in really inefficient homes are really exposed at the moment to rising prices. Energy costs and supply issues, that includes rising prices, but we also saw in Usha's example, she's on a prepayment meter, and that's a particular form of energy supply. And there's a big controversy at the moment about people being forced onto prepay meters as a result of the energy crisis. So that's a real concern at the moment in terms of the way that people are able to access energy. Electricity and gas from prepay meters tends to cost more than it does if you're paying on a direct debit scheme. All the other issues are relevant still in the crisis, but I suppose the other one that I think is going to become really important is that last one, ill health, physical and mental ill health. Mainly because a lot of the people that we're meeting at the moment are really not intending to heat at all and are not currently heating at all. And as a result, the sort of mental health toll of that is huge, as well as the physical health toll associated with some of the things that you all know about, for instance, increasing mould and the respiratory effects, but also health effects that are associated with circulatory diseases and so on, or disability in general, as we saw with Usha. So some key points from this initial work then. I think it's important to know that back in 2016, it was fair to say that absolute poverty was already in evidence in the UK. In 2016, this was probably for more extreme cases where we found people not heating or eating. This year, I think that's changing, and I think this year is a real concern, actually, that that's going to become more and more apparent further up, pardon me, further up the income scale. I would say also that this evidence suggests that vulnerability is quite complex. People experience it due to a number of intersecting reasons. Excuse me, just a minute. I'm about to get my voice back. So these intersecting factors can compound vulnerability. So for instance, if you live in a cold home, it can make you ill physically. can also make you ill mentally. It might mean that you don't have a social life because you don't want to invite anyone into your home, or you're embarrassed to go to other people's home, as Usha was. And as a result, that can compound mental illness issues. So effectively, our point of view from back in 2015 was we need to open up more social explanations of these problems. And in particular, we were interested in the aspects of tenancy relations, and also social relations within the household and outside, because those were things that back in 2015 hadn't really been talked about very much. So we set off on a couple of big group collaboration projects on this topic, which led to a couple of publications, working on secondary qualitative data, so already collected qualitative data, to answer new questions about energy poverty, in particular to find out how people's social lives and their connections to others shape what they do. So we call this social relations, and what we mean by this is really, we argue here that understanding energy consumption as a solitary activity engaged in by individuals is really commonplace, but it's also misleading, because people are social and their connections to each other impact on the way that they consume energy. And the typology that we proposed in this paper that I wrote with Tom Hargreaves was highlighting the sort of types of social relationship that shape energy consumption. So briefly, these comprise of family and friends, relationships with agencies and communities, and relationships of identity, so being part of a social group in some way. We argue that understanding people's relationships and how they shape energy consumption offers new ways of thinking about how to intervene from a policy perspective, but it also tells us a lot about how people consume energy, because much of that consumption is actually done in a very social way. It's not done as individuals effectively. This is a very sociology way of looking at energy consumption, and that's kind of my disciplinary background, so that's why we end up in this sort of space. Just to return briefly to Usha then, and if we look at her social relations on those three levels, and I'll just pick out the points I've highlighted in red here. Her disability results in a certain kind of dependency on others, which she really hates, but that she needs that in order to access energy and energy services. Which suggests there's something wrong with the way that we design energy and energy services, because ideally she wouldn't have to do that. But it also makes us think that if somebody wasn't so well networked as Usha, they would be in a lot of trouble if they didn't have people to go and pop up their prepay meter for them, for instance. In terms of relationship in a sort of more institutional way with agencies and communities around her, the fact that she's a tenant means that she has to have a prepay meter. That's often something that is enforced by landlords, but what it means is she therefore doesn't have access to cheaper energy. She also has to manage her energy in that way that's really inconvenient for her as a disabled woman. So thinking about the way that the system is set up, it's sort of and promotes this kind of behaviour is something that could be used in policy thinking. And then the fact that she has these different multiple identities. She's a Pakistani mother, she's disabled, she used to be a lawyer, all these things shape the way that she thinks about her consumption. And I think that's quite interesting when we think about how policy would deal with Usha or other people that are like her in some ways and different in others. So if you imagine a single older man who are typically the least socially well connected in society, with no social support network, they suddenly look a lot more vulnerable than Usha in this context. Doesn't mean that it's necessarily right that Usha's family are stepping in and providing a lot of these services, but the older single man suddenly looks very vulnerable. Okay, so I'm going to leave the lived experience stuff and move on to the policy analysis. I've kind of thought about this with relation to various places. I started thinking about policy because of the lived experience work, as I said earlier. When you get this detailed understanding of people's daily challenges, you can't help in a way but turn that round to think about how could we manage this better, do policy better for these people. So I just wanted to start off by pointing out that there are really different national conceptualisations of this problem. And international comparison is really valuable because it reminds us of that the way we conceive of it is not a given. And it can also make us think about the problem in different ways, as we've definitely had in the work I've done with Cyril. So a really common conception of this in richer EU nations, Germany, the Netherlands, I'd say probably Denmark as well. And the Netherlands, I should point out, until we intervened in 2021 and wrote a white paper about energy poverty in the Netherlands. The common way of thinking about it is this is just a symptom of poverty and can be dealt with poverty policy. You don't need a specific set of policy to deal with this. To some extent, I'm sympathetic to that idea. Ultimately, a lot of the things I'm describing about Usha's life are symptoms of a poor benefit system, or the fact that she's a single parent and therefore there's no other income coming into their home. And those are kind of poverty related. However, the value of thinking about energy poverty is in who you get to talk to as a result. And so stakeholders like energy companies, energy suppliers are brought into a conversation on poverty, and buildings experts, and just turn my lights back on, buildings experts and buildings engineers and so on are brought into that conversation in a way that they don't get brought in from a general conversation about poverty. The French way of understanding this, which I really like, I'll have to say, is that it's a complex issue taking multiple forms which have overlapping but not mutually exclusive populations. And specifically there, what they do is they say some people feel cold and other people underconsume, and they don't necessarily overlap in terms of who those people are, but we respect the fact that both of those have a problem of some sort. And I think that's a really interesting and useful way of looking at it, because it kind of captures vulnerable people from all sorts of different parts of the population. And I'll talk in a bit more detail in a minute about this. In Denmark, we would probably characterize the position as we don't have energy poverty in homes, but we do have mould. There are similar causal factors here that create energy poverty and mould, but it's an interesting spin on things, which is why we started investigating it in a bit of detail, as I'll say in a minute. I've also done a fair bit of work on the politics of national conception, so specifically in England, and I looked at that first because I live here, but also because we were the first mover on fuel poverty with Brenda Boardman, who's now Dame Brenda Boardman. She's an academic working in Oxford, and she was also really an activist on these issues and has been for a long time, and is still doing that in her Dame hood. And as a result of her writing her PhD on this, then writing a book on it, and then kind of getting it into UK policy, the UK is now seen as a leader by the EU and other member states. The way that we conceive of this problem in England has caused problems, however, and that's partly, I think, because of the culture of government in the UK, where we have a really strong steer towards picking one measure to define the problem. And the three measures we've had so far are listed on screen there. I won't tell you exactly how they work because it's kind of a long conversation, although I'm happy to say that at the end. But I think that the important thing to know is the way that the problem is defined and the way that indicators are picked have a really big impact on what is and what is not on the table in terms of potential solutions. And one of the big issues we have at the moment is that both the last two definitions, low income, high cost, and low income, low energy efficiency, massively centre energy efficiency, but as a result, other causes of fuel poverty are left out. So poverty is left out as a sort of root of this problem, and energy prices are left out. So we are now left with this lily measure in a crisis, in a energy price crisis. And we're in a situation where when the stats come out, which to be honest is in 2 years' time anyway, on 2022-23, there will be no rise in fuel poverty because it doesn't take very much. Energy prices don't affect the way it's measured very much. And so, I mean, I think it means that we're in a fairly urgent position with regards to thinking again about how we measure this problem, because clearly there is a rise in energy poverty in every sense, but it's not going to come out in the government statistics. And that's to do with the politics of not wanting to talk about the market, so not wanting to challenge the fact we have an energy market, and not wanting to talk about poverty in the last 12 years as austerity came underway, and effectively as we've had a more right-leaning government. So to say a little bit about where this is on the European Union agenda, and again, we have academic activists to thank for this. So this is Stefan Brzezinski at Manchester and Harriet Thompson at Birmingham, who've played a really important role in raising this in the EU context. There are now policies that explicitly speak to this agenda, so through the energy transition and the renovation wave policies. And there are also really specific requirements for member states to define the criteria, measure the problem and create policy on the problem. And in fact, then the European is pushing this agenda down into member states. And so in the national energy and climate plans, there has to be a reporting system around this problem. You can see the things that people have to report on the slide. So in the Netherlands, when we made our intervention, where we wrote a white paper to say you need to have a better policy on, you need to have a policy on this, there was us as sort of a group of academics and researchers saying that. There's the EU pushing down, but also interestingly, cities pushing upwards, because cities can see it as a problem in the everyday. And so there's a sort of three-way push on the Dutch government in particular. This will be different in different nations, but I think it's quite interesting to see how the politics of this rises up the agenda effectively. And obviously now, with the energy crisis, it's pretty high on loads of people's agendas. So then, just because this work I've done with Cyril, that Cyril's led, to be clear, on mould or cold, this really links into some of the policy work that I've done before, because it's about those policy conceptualisations of the problem. And here we see that in Denmark and England, there are really radically different understandings of a similar problem. So it's another form of critical policy analysis, as I've talked about, but this time it's about how mould is dealt with in these hugely contrasting ways in Denmark and England. So to start with, I just wanted to say that these are quite different places. So for instance, Denmark has double the energy efficiency in dwellings. It has lower health effects of the cold. So this is measured in terms of excess winter death. It has pretty much half the poverty rates of the UK. But as I'm sure Cyril would really like me to say, Denmark is not heaven. There are still people living in inadequate dwellings, and that's quite a similar number to the UK number. And there are also similar housing cost overburdens. So people are as typically, there's a similar number of people paying more than 40% of their disposable income on their housing costs. So some aspects are clearly more conducive to avoiding cold or mould. Some aspects are still relatively similar to in the UK. And then I just wanted to sort of briefly characterize, given the amount of time I have, how problems and solutions are differently conceived in the different nations. And to start with Denmark and characterizing the problem as mould, important to say that in Denmark, mould is really a societal issue in the sense that it's something that's talked about a lot. A lot of energy goes into it in terms of and money goes into managing mould in households. It's really quite high on the agenda. Having said that, poverty is not broadly considered a problem in Denmark. So as many of the people that you would talk to about this would think would feel a little suspicious if you started talking about poverty in Denmark, because it's sort of the public conversation says it's not a problem effectively. In Denmark, mould requires expert intervention, even for a small amount. And the way that somebody described this to Cyril was if you can't cover it with your hands, then it's a small amount. We even had discussion of a coin-sized amount of mould being a small amount that still needs some form of expert intervention, which feels like a million miles away from the UK context. There's a culture of regular ventilation in households. So there's this sort of idea that you ventilate your rooms twice a day, for open the windows to make sure that you're getting fresh air in. And there's also this phenomenon of revenge reporting of mould to the local authority, where because tenants have a lot of power in Denmark, it can be a means of kind of grassing on your landlord in a way. And so people will do this as a sort of means of sort of flexing their muscles in a way as a tenant in Denmark. So the contrasting situation in England is very much that we see cold as a health issue, and that mould is subsidiary to that. So in all the official documentation, that's how it's kind of conceptualized. So mould is an outcome of cold, as opposed to and then a health issue, as opposed to a health issue sort of directly in itself. The sort of solutions that come up for mould in the UK, often discussions of better housekeeping, so how people can ventilate better, can not dry damp clothes inside, and all those sorts of things, but also bringing up quite often mould is just painted over with fungicidal paint, which I think would probably horrify some of the Danish mould experts. There's a fear of ventilation, particularly among fuel poor households, because of the risk that will expose you to the cold. And the sort of revenge that happens in the UK rental sector would be revenge eviction of tenants in response to complaints. So often people are scared of complaining because the power is with the landlord in the UK context. So just to point out that these experiences of mould, so people living in a house with mould in it, the experience will be so different in these two different nations. And there are associated impacts of that on public health. So the public health effects of mould in the UK are likely to be quite a lot higher, given the way that it's managed in the two different nations, and and that's linked to the way that it's conceived of in the two different nations. And then I wanted to say that I think this is a particular problem this year, because we are meeting so many people talking about not heating at all. And I think as we go into the winter, we're going to start to see these increasing mould growth related to health effects to that increasing mould growth. So it's a real concern in the UK, and probably in Denmark as well, although a lesser concern, because it obviously the heating regimes are a lot warmer effectively in Denmark. But Denmark is denying poverty, while England kind of denies the centrality of mould and health effects by framing the problem as fuel poverty rather than as a mould problem. Okay, so just briefly to introduce my Wellbased project before I finish. So this is a European project, interdisciplinary study of energy poverty, and why it's interesting for you in particular is because we are measuring internal air quality as well as temperature and damp in the homes that where we're doing the research. So it's funded by the EU, as I say, and it's both an intervention and an evaluation project. It involves these 6 case study cities, an interdisciplinary team of researchers, and we're all working towards improving health, wellbeing and inequality by designing policy for tackling energy poverty. Briefly on the research design, I just wanted to point out that we're trying to explain what change happens for whom, in which circumstances and why, with a number of different interventions in the 6 different cities. But for your interest, we are monitoring air quality, temperature and damp using kind of those devices that you leave in people's homes and ask them to ignore. And from my perspective, we're asking people a range of questions about their experience of energy poverty in qualitative interviews. So we're bringing together that sort of lived experience stuff I talked about at the beginning, together with the air quality stuff that you're all interested in. In Leeds, we're working on a project where some tower blocks are being renovated, so effectively being insulated, well insulated. And most of the people we're working with are social housing tenants from very diverse backgrounds, including a fairly high rate of immigrant households, low-income households, but with varied family types. And we're going to follow these buildings within the neighbourhood as it's subject to substantial renovation. So as the sort of energy efficiency levels go up to A and B, probably A to be honest. And the intervention for this started in September 2022, so really in the last month or two, and we've also started data collection on that. Yamika in the picture is one of my colleagues that's collecting the health data. So we hope to have some really interesting interdisciplinary data on a combination of that sort of lived experience and health, and then also air quality data soon. I wanted to just finish with some ideas of prospects for collaboration, and I am already in discussion with Kath about various things that we could do, but if there's others that want to talk, and to me that's great. To point out, I suppose, that my expertise is in this qualitative work and in critical policy research. So if there's any sort of ventilation policy research ideas that people would like to follow up, that'd be really interesting for me, and probably also for Cyril. I'm interested also in working in interdisciplinary ways, looking sociologically at internal air quality associated with mould, for instance. But I also wanted to point out that I'm leading this another project that's just kind of started at the moment, that's funded by the Impact Accelerator money from Leeds, called Fuel Poverty Evidence. And there we're trying to bring together the academic community on the works on fuel poverty in the face of this growing public interest, and to sort of produce various resources through that community. So, I mean, actually, it'd be really great to produce something on air quality and fuel poverty as part of that. Maybe, and by producing something, I mean something very kind of applied rather than academic, using the information and the knowledge that we have already to produce resources for non-academics to be able to think about these things. So if you are interested in something fuel poverty related that you think I probably am not an expert in, I'm also really happy to connect you with people in the UK and beyond. And we are making a directory of fuel poverty expertise. So hopefully that will be out very soon, and you can always use that as a means of getting into finding people to work with. So just thank you for listening, and I wanted to particularly name check Pepper, who is now working with me on the Wellbased project, but has done a lot of this lived experience work with me already. And also Cyril, who's here today, which is lovely, and she doesn't mind being called the mould lady because she knows what she doesn't know about mould isn't worth knowing, and she's in Aalborg in Denmark. And Yamika also, who's doing the health data collection for us at the University of Leeds. Thank you very much.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you so much, Lucie, for that really good talk. And I think really sort of gets us thinking about maybe some of the things that the people in this group don't always think about, and those really complex societal challenges and social interactions that define this. I'm going to ask whether people have got questions. I can see there is already well, it might be more of a comment than a question in the chat, but I'll say anyway. So Bernard has put in designing and providing positive energy homes, those which produce more energy than consume, merits serious consideration. Outgoings on energy consumption might be reversed into income for producing it and supplying it. As a challenge we have to step up and resolving. Any thoughts around that? I mean, is that something we should be doing as a society, and can it solve some of these problems?
I actually think that the people I work with when I'm working on fuel poverty are the place to invest when it comes to energy efficiency. I mean, there's a report out this week arguing this from Centre for Sustainable Energy, saying we should go for council housing first. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One of them is to do with the fact that the relationships exist already between building companies and those and council housing and social housing in a broad sense, housing association housing. It's kind of scale, it has scale, but also because those people are really struggling at the moment. And I mean, there are other areas of society in the UK in which people are struggling, but on the other hand, I mean, starting to kind of really go for a huge kind of retrofit program, I think is really essential. Because if you look at the Danish context, their housing is twice as efficient as ours, effectively. And that means they come into this winter in a completely different frame of mind, right? I mean, they still have problems, but at the same time, they're unlikely to have the level of problems that we sometimes find in the UK.
I've got there's a whole raft of things appearing in the chat now, so I'll pick some of them out. So Kate has asked, she's very interested in what Jan Mike's going to be finding out, and anything more you can tell us there.
Yeah, so Yamika's our health data expert, and she's going to be measuring, let's see if I can remember them all, blood oxygen levels, blood pressure, heart rate, and peak flow of our kind of intervention group participants over the time of the project. She's already started, in fact, doing these measurements, and there's also some sort of sleep monitoring, and that's for at the European project level to be looking across different case studies in different cities to see whether there's an impact the interventions that we make on people's health. We also have a health survey, which includes the kind of classic questions on mental health. There's a name for them. There's a sort of public health set of questions, and so we can compare our control group. So we can compare our intervention group to the general population as well as to the control group that we're using.
Well, that sounds quite exciting. There's a lot of interesting data going to come out of that.
Yes.
One from Yangang Ying who said, can you elaborate more on the impacts of real-time monitoring and control? Is there anything you can say there?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't know. Yangang, do you mean the impacts on participants of real-time monitoring control, or?
It's just a general building kind of indoor environment kind of monitoring. It's my background is in building services, and then thinking the mold is combination of moisture, temperature, ventilation. Yeah.
And so I suppose by measuring those things, we probably will be able to explain mold.
Or changing the behavior. Yeah, reduce the mold.
Yeah. I guess we're not intervening in behaviour in this instance. Because I suppose intervention in behaviour would probably mean encouraging ventilation, and we're not really in a position to ask people to do that. I don't think the intervention in the homes, the ventilation in the homes we're looking at is too bad, partly because it's got really ill-fitting windows, and I think there's probably an element of that. But it'll be really interesting to see whether, when they're insulated, whether the ventilation becomes a problem actually because of the levels of insulation going on. We'll have to see how that comes out.
Yeah, and I think they're probably not environments where there's a real-time control going to come into them either, but there may be things where you could, with the data from monitoring, you can be able to inform people about things more. I'm just going down where there are actually questions. Alison Tomlin commented about, I think, your previous answer about private rental homes which have worse energy efficiency than social housing.
Yes.
And I don't know whether you want to make any comments about private rental in comparison.
Yeah, we're working on private rental, another project I'm working on, and trying to think about ways of kind of solving that. And one of the things that we think is really important is to do with having some sort of concerted work really around getting landlords involved in these kind of issues. And so I would say in Leeds that's been done quite well, and there are instances in which Leeds City Council have really strongly engaged with private rented landlords. And we also, another case study we have is in Brighton, and in Brighton it's just not happening at all. I mean, there's nothing there really to support landlords through the process. And I think we do have this tendency to sort of think of landlords as the baddie in all of this, but actually, I mean, in Brighton they're struggling because they don't really know what to do. And when you look at the sort of government programmes that exist to encourage action, there's a lot of stick and not that much carrot. So it's about trying to work out how to bridge that gap in interests, I suppose, between landlords and tenants. But I guess, I mean, getting the social housing sector sorted in the first place makes sense, because you get a lot of learning goes on for councils, and then that they can start to use that learning in the private rented sector as well, I think.
I mean, the sort of barriers there, I mean, I'm just noting there's a comment that Andrew's put in around that they've just surveyed a property and installed solutions and things. Obviously solutions exist. Do we think that there's the issue is around the solutions, or do you think the issue is much more tied up in the funding for these solutions, the schemes to provide them, the ways that people can access it, particularly if they're on low incomes?
Yes. And I mean, there's insufficient funding for sure, but it's also about the way that funding is offered and delivered, and it tends to be very complex and require quite a lot of work. There's also a loss of faith between the actual people that will implement this stuff, the building companies and the government, because things have gone wrong in the past, and so there's this sort of loss of trust that's happened. So there's a huge amount of work to be done to rebuild that, and then also to provide enough money to sort this stuff out. I mean, one of the reasons I would say social housing is a great place to start is because it hasn't, that loss of trust hasn't happened in that sector in a way, and that they have this really great track record of doing things, but they do. So in Leeds, for instance, there's 8 streets in Holbeck where they've insulated streets which include social housing, private rented housing, and owner occupiers. They've done them all sort of hyper insulated effectively, these 8 streets, back-to-back terraces, typical Leeds kind of construction, in a particular area in Holbeck. And it's brilliant because it's involving all those different tenancy types and allowing, you know, finding a way to find the money to do all of this. But it's sort of on a wing and a prayer a little bit in terms of the funding. And then, I mean, really what you want from that is to go for the rest of the back-to-back housing in Leeds. It's all over the place. And that's where it stops in a way. They've done this sort of experimental work, but they don't get the chance to kind of reproduce that, I think, for the level that we need them to be able to do.
It'd be really interesting to go in and measure those houses and survey those houses now and see whether there are differences in what people are doing and what the environments are like, and link that to their tenancy type in some way. You know, they've kind of all got the same, they've all had the same intervention. Is the same intervention working effectively in all the same for all of them or not?
Yeah. Really interesting question.
Slightly different question from Geo, which says in their current research, they've used disability adjusted life years to link harm to exposure to indoor air contaminants, including mould. And are you thinking of what metrics are you thinking of using to link harm for energy poverty and mould?
Oh, that's really interesting, Gio. I'd like to see that if you wouldn't mind sharing it with me. That sounds really interesting. We haven't really thought about it yet, I don't think. We're just trying to work out. I mean, we certainly would be, because we're measuring peak flow, that's one of the things that might be linked in. But yeah, I haven't had those thoughts properly yet. It's probably not my area of the project, but I think if you could pass on that work, I will make sure it gets to some of my colleagues that could use that.
Yeah, that would be great. Excellent. I'm going to ask a couple more questions and then we'll call it a day. So one from Jenny, who said, it's ironic if badly fitting windows provides better ventilation than mechanical ventilation in new homes, but there is evidence, oh, hang on, I hate it when the screen jumps. There is evidence that fuel poverty can lead to residents switching off mechanical ventilation, leading to worse air quality in older homes. Have you seen any of that type of thing?
I am aware of that, Jenny, thank you. I would say that, I mean, there's also all sorts of evidence of poor practice. I think, you know, from the point of view of people wanting to save money on electricity and therefore doing things in different ways. I think, yeah, we have to deal with it by effectively when the renovation happens. We also need some kind of intervention associated with behaviour, I think. We are doing that in the Wellbased case. We've got the Green Doctors involved in doing a sort of more behaviour-based intervention. But that sort of also remains to be seen what the effects are, because they're not replacing all of the windows, for instance. So that's a really, this is a sort of example of how the funding comes into councils. They've got enough money to do the insulation, but they haven't got the money to do the heating system this year. So they're doing that in a couple of years' time. And I mean, if this was more kind of thought through, they'd probably be doing everything at once. Maybe then they'd have to move people out, and they don't really want to have to do that because it's a hassle. And so there's all these sort of challenges, I think, but definitely some sort of behavioural stuff, because there's so many examples of poorly thought through kind of technical interventions that then fail because of behavioural issues. Even like there's a paper just out in Nature Energy, or about to come out soon, that I reviewed. There was where they put the monitor for the solar panels in the loft. So if you wanted to know when the solar panels were producing energy, you had to go up into the loft to have a look, which is clearly not going to help people save money or save energy. But yeah.
Yeah, and in fact, actually, Andrew again has commented about the solutions market with poor knowledge and experience, and people who don't care about quality or competence, wrong products incorrectly specified, wrongly installed, other dependencies missed, and the competence of installers is never questioned. So I think there's definitely something in there about how you get the right stuff in the right places.
Yeah, my colleague Alice Owen in my department works a lot on these sorts of issues. So she works on as she puts it, white van man and the white van man's role in the retrofit project in a way. And so I think if anyone's interested, you should follow up with her.
That's great, thank you. And last one I'm going to ask is from VK, which is, what's the biggest difference between environments which facilitate works and progress and those which don't? Is it down to individuals or is it a system solution?
Oh, I think it's rare. Sometimes it's down to individuals, but it tends to be fairly rarely down to individuals. It is much more systemic than that. Although one of the things that we're doing in the retrofit project that we're looking at able to pay households is we do think that there's a lot of importance in the relationships that people hold, and that's why I said at the beginning a while ago that council and housing association housing is a good place to start, because the relationships there are already strong. There's already that existing sort of pattern of working together with a contractor, for instance, to create to do this kind of retrofit work. And so there is an element of the individuals being quite important. So in Leeds, for instance, there's one person who kind of leads the retrofit work in Leeds, and if he ever goes for one reason or another, that could really undermine a lot of the work that Leeds City Council do on this issue, because he has a lot of contacts with other people. He has those relationships he's built up over many years with suppliers, with contractors, but also with tenants and with the people in the city. And I think as those people move on, you lose a lot, I think, when people move out of a system like that. So the individuals can be important. They're sort of important in a relational way.
Yeah, that's great, thank you. I've just got a couple more actually. So I'm just going to highlight that somebody from the Alliance for Sustainable Building Products has just put in the chat that the coroner's ruled on the death of our shack in Manchester that mould was the cause. So that's quite interesting to see that that's in the headlines. I'm going to actually take chair's privilege and ask you the very last question, which is, if you could recommend either to individuals or to government one thing that people should do, what would it be? What would you do? If you were trying to tackle things this winter, what would you try and do? Which is, I know that's a hard question.
Yeah, it's such a mess, Kath, to be honest. I mean, I think recommending to individuals is really challenging, because individuals in my fuel poverty work or energy poverty work are in a very vulnerable place this winter. And so I mean, the people I'm talking to through our intervention, I'm recommending they go to the Green Doctors and get as much information about how to best use their energy as they can, and some small fixes around the house as a means of getting through the winter, really. But and then for government, I think get this blooming retrofit programs on going, because we just really need it. We really need it. We don't need it just for fuel poverty. We need it for environmental reasons. We need it for health reasons, and we need to do a good job of it, involving people like yourselves in thinking about the ventilation issues associated with that. It's time we really sorted it out. It's like public infrastructure, our housing system, and it's public infrastructure which is substandard, and we need to do something about it.
And I think it needs to be a flexible retrofit. I mean, there's so many of these schemes which are, you can have this insulation, or you can have this boiler, or you can have a heat pump, but they're the one issue thing, and it actually, you need to be able to get that funding to do the right retrofit for that property.
Yeah, that would be definitely something that the Leeds City Council would support. Could I just make a last plea then?
Yes.
That if anyone does want to write about mould and the current energy crisis in that sort of an accessible format, 2-pager policy brief, that kind of thing, get in touch, because we can support you with our fuel poverty evidence project. In doing that, we have a comms professional employed to help out, so she can help with the writing, Beth Harrison. And if there's an appetite for that, I'd really like for that to come out, because I feel like otherwise, I'm not an expert on it and I can't write it, but I think like otherwise these issues are kind of only touched on in the press, and not really with the evidence that you all have to be able to talk about that. Yeah,
that's great, and thank you for that. I think that was a really interesting session. I thought it was fascinating, and I think it really makes us think about how there's this real complexity between, you know, the behavioural aspects, the system and funding aspects, and the built environment, and that all really comes to a crunch when you've got people in poor quality housing who have got the least income. And I think it's you know, it's too easy for most of us to not see that, and I think it's really important that you're bringing out the importance of that and showing it to people, because yeah, it's absolutely critical. So thank you ever so much, Lucie. Thank you as well to Sirid, who I know you didn't really weren't in the presentation, but I know you've done a huge amount of the work around mould and linking across to Denmark, and it's quite fascinating as well seeing some differences and similarities, but interesting that those differences in how things are perceived as much as how, you know, the differences in the environment itself. So really good session. Thank you so much. As usual, we will post this on our website, and I'm sure people will be interested in follow up on this as well. So thank you.
Thanks very much.
Right, cheers everybody. Thanks. Bye now. Bye.
Bye.